Welcome to today's webinar. I will give you an overview of what it takes to go from the idea you want to transform into a dissertation to the product you are ready to submit to your committee or supervisor. This is like a kind of eye-opener to help you realize what you have to face when you are developing a dissertation. Before talking about what you are expected to do when writing a dissertation, I would like to present you a very important aspect of that process: the commitment to persist doing a task that more than once will be felt as overwhelming. And the quote illustrates the kind of commitment you need to successfully finish your work. Developing a dissertation is not only a cognitive task, but mostly an attitudinal one. You have to wish the prize at the end lies so much that you can keep your mind focused on that prize and not on the distress that challenges and difficulties would cause on you. Besides, you have to believe you can do it. And how do you know you can do it? Because you are intelligent enough to have reached an academic level that many people never achieved. And you get up every day thinking on the task and persisting in doing it. This is the agenda of this webinar. As usual, we'll go from understanding the target concept to giving you some guidelines to help you in the process. Many people write dissertations, and because of that, we may assume that everybody knows what it is. However, that is not the case. Students and professors may have different ideas about not only the conceptual view of that product, but also about what should be done in it. That's why the first part of the webinar will be devoted to talk about what a dissertation is expected to be. And let's begin discussing what a dissertation is not, so you can have a picture of the path you shouldn't go through. If you reflect upon what is behind the 4 characteristics presented in the slide, you may realize that a dissertation is by no means a sloppy product. It doesn't have superficial analysis, incoherent parts, outdated ideas, or worthless focus. So you may ask, what is a dissertation? Well, it is an innovative, critical, coherent, valid, and meaningful piece of work according to the characteristics mentioned in the slide. Okay. Of course, we are using some rhythm that perhaps don't let you at this moment to think very deeply on what you are looking at. But don't worry, because on the handouts tab there, you have a copy of this presentation. So don't worry about getting at that. And of course, you are going to get the recording. Just put your mind into what we are saying. Therefore, a dissertation can be defined in this way. Please pay attention to the words in red and try to find out what all of them have in common, because that is the essence of a dissertation. independent, new, relevant, critical, coherent, and appropriate. All those words are far from a sloppy dissertation, something that is not well thought and well developed. Okay? And because of that, a dissertation provides an accurate reflection of its author. Believe that, okay? What you write reflects how are you or how you are. It tells readers how their mind works, how well they transmit a message that is so important to them, or in this case to you and your field of study, that you spend many years to develop it. So if you are so interested in doing a dissertation and you spend too much time doing it, what you write should reflect what you think. Okay? Now, is it possible to know what should be done to produce a good dissertation? Yes, it is. There are some principles that you may use to guide your actions. And let's have a look at some of them. Welcome, Noel. These principles refer to how you may approach the pivotal elements of a dissertation, the main elements of a dissertation, which means research, problem research, question, purpose, theories, methodology, and those are the pivotal elements of the dissertation. These principles point out the need for a relevant and well-defined research problem. Research questions that provide the answers to interpret and usually propose a solution to that problem. Theories that give explanations and promote advances. Methodology that lets gather valid data. Results that can be interpreted using what is discussed in the literature review. And conclusions that don't go beyond what the data suggest. Welcome, listen. As it is suggested in the previous slide, the research problem is the trigger and the center of doing a study that becomes a dissertation. But what do you think of when referring to a research problem? It is something important to know what it is, because it is the main element of the whole work. In a very concise way, it is what the slide says. The key point is that something has called your attention, since either you cannot interpret it fully or don't know how to solve it. Therefore, you want to study. However, that may not be enough or clever to develop a research study intended to become a dissertation. And you may ask, why not? Because a research study implies such number of tasks that you have to be sure that it is worth it to spend valuable resources on studying the problem. Is it possible to know that before beginning the study? Absolutely. And here you have the criteria you may use to know how promising a research problem is. We at Doctoral Net have created an automation to evaluate that, and I have conducted previous webinars explaining each one of those criteria. Please check them so you can understand this point better. Okay, now you say, I know what is behind doing a dissertation. I know that it's very important to be sure that my research problem is promising, but how can I actually write down or develop the dissertation? Well, now it's time to talk about how you can approach the task of developing each chapter of your dissertation. Of course, the guidelines I will provide are just some of the many options available, but they can be an initial set to evaluate which ones address your cognitive and learning styles and your university or supervisor's requirements. This is the most common structure of a dissertation, but you have to check your university or supervisor's points of view in order to be sure of what you are expected to do. Let's begin, but which usually is the beginning. Some people say don't begin your dissertation by chapter 1, begin it by chapter 3. And I always say, okay, perhaps you are not going to begin your chapter right in chapter 1, but you need the information that should be in chapter 1, because if you don't have that information, you may be lost. And that is why chapter 1, as you will see, functions as a guiding light element to develop your dissertation. The lighthouse. And because chapter 1 states what you think should be studied, the theoretical and research framework within it should be studied, what you expect to achieve, what you have to answer or test, how you will look for that answer or do that test. Well, we always have to look at it at chapter 1 in order to know what to do. And because of that, it is the lighthouse that guides your dissertation. So, despite the fact that you have not written the complete chapter 1, you need to have very clear the content of that chapter in order to develop the rest of your dissertation. And although it depends on each university requirements, these elements are usually included in chapter 1. They are not necessarily presented as headings, but they are included in the text. And you have to remember that. If you look at them, perhaps at the beginning you don't need an introduction, but you will need the background, which is in fact previous studies that will give you idea of what has been studied so far, how they have studied that, and that can guide you in order to understand. Let's see, Adrian, can we say the research problem is like the synopsis of a detective story? I love your analogy. Yes, it is. Wherein the conflicted interests of the suspects are highlighted. This hypnosis, however, does not directly constitute the motive for committing the crime, etc. Yes, and that's why you will need to ask yourself questions like, what could have been the motive of all this crime? Or who is this? Who can be suspect of doing it? And it's the same thing. Yeah, I love your analogy. Thank you, Adrian. Okay. And then here you have a simple flow chart of the process you may follow to develop the first chapter of your dissertation. However, please be aware that the stages may not be in a linear sequence, and that in fact, they mostly tend to fit each other And therefore, the process is much more interactive than this representation suggests. This representation was made just for pedagogical reasons, right? But if you, for instance, if you find a change in the previous studies that you are considering, then you perhaps you have to pay attention to the problem statement if you have to change it, or perhaps that implies that you have to change your methodological framework. And any change in the methodological framework may be or has to be taken into consideration when you are writing your questions or your objective or your hypothesis. So it's more interactive than this flow chart, but it could be done in this way too. But always remembering that you have to adjust previous stages whenever you make changes in one stage. Okay, welcome, Triana. And you know that I love to suggest you things to do your dissertation in a more coherent and easy way. And these guidelines are product of years of experience mentoring students to fulfill the dissertation process. And as you can see, they refer to the need of being clear and concise when communicating your ideas, as well as emphasizing the significance of the whole work. Those things are very, very important, because when you have to define the problem, your purpose, your pivotal elements in a clear way. Thanks that you are now here, Triana. And you have to write concisely. You don't have to expand your ideas in such a way that readers can lose the track of your thoughts. So this chapter has to be written in a concise way, in a clear way, that anybody that reads your problem, your research question, your main theories, and your basic methodology can say, aha, I know what this is going about. How is it going in this way? Okay, a dissertation, as I explained before, is based on critical analysis and discussion of ideas. That's why literature review is needed. It provides the foundation upon which the whole structure of the dissertation is built. It's very important to have a strong and supported literature review in order to have, as a consequence of that, a strong foundation that lets you address the problem, the theories, and all the things that you need. And that characteristic responds to the purpose stated in this slide. Discuss the theoretical elements that explain the problem and the related previous studies. And because of that purpose, the chapter intends to present the state of art of the field of study of the research problem, identify and justify the gaps of information related to it, and connect them to what has been studied before. Always pay attention to this purpose and this objective when you are developing your literature review. Whatever you include in your literature review has to be relevant to the research problem. You cannot just put things there to make your literature review longer, because that will impact the quality of your work. Okay, the three parts mentioned are the basic structure to develop a literature review, but your university or committee may ask for a different one. You have to check that. In October, there will be an automated webinar about how to do a literature review. In fact, it is the recording of a webinar that I did explaining how to approach literature review. And you're invited to register for that webinar. It is automated, but it was done live some time ago. Good. Like it happened with Chapter 1, this flow chart may be useful to plan your literature review, but remember that the stages may not be in a linear sequence. But as you see there, it is important to identify the study variables. In other words, what is involved in the problem. Because if you don't know that, you may lose track when you try to explain the problem. I mean, how can you explain a problem if you don't know exactly what is involved in that problem? And when you identify the studies variable, then you can go to look for relevant theories, models, and approaches that explain those variables, and you look for relevant previous studies that have worked those variables. And with all that information, you go to establish how theories and previous studies relate to your own study. Okay? And then you use an organizing tool to prepare the chapter to check its coherence. And you write the first draft. Marion says, I'm confused to how we can define the problem and the theoretical framework clear before doing the research at the literature review. In fact, I always find myself going back and forth between the two. That's why I tell you. I mean, I'm not saying that you are not going to identify the study problems before writing the problem. What I'm saying is that this is the way to write down your literature review, to approach your literature review. But just from the beginning to the end, you are going to be going forth and backwards between your literature review and your problem, your research questions, the methodology, because that's why I say that literature review is the foundation of the study. And how can you build the complete thing without doing the foundation? Okay, so the first thing that you do usually is that you say something like this. I don't know, I have seen something at work or in a book that called my attention because I'm not quite sure what was happening there. It calls my attention. Okay, let me look for more information related to that. And you begin looking for relevant theory, looking for previous studies. And then you say, I had identified a gap of information on what I have read. And that gap of information is, in fact, from where you infer the research problem. Once you have identified the research problem, you go back to the books, to the previous studies, in order to find out what are the studies, the variables involved in that problem. And when you do that, you always go back to the sources in order to check which theories, models, approaches, and previous study can be useful. Okay, Adrian said it in a very clear way, as usual, my dear. Just because the problem and theoretical framework belong to Chapter 1 by no means imply that they would be clearly worked out before we move on to the literature review chapter. In other words, it's a non-linear process, as I have said before. That's true. I mean, it's a is an interactive process in which you can find the starting point either in your daily life, in your professional life, or in a book, in an article, in a written source, on a previous study. But sometimes you identify the problem just having a look around you. Okay? All right. So based on all those things, I suggest you these things. That this list of suggestions is based on criteria like completeness, relationships, current state of the art, and productivity when registering sources. That's why I have suggested you these things, which is very important. I mean, it's not Elena, it's Maria. Okay? And it's Maria and Adrian. Okay, but don't worry. Okay, so you have to discuss all the variables of the problem. And that's why it is important to know what variables are involved. Because if you left one variable out, how can you be sure that that variable is not the answer to the problem you are dealing with? And you have to make connections among the variables, other studies, and identify gaps of information. It is also important that you use sources that are from the last 5 at most 10 years old, unless they are seminal studies of the field of the study. And is very useful if you use a software to register your sources, but if you don't forget to include other things besides the usual information of author, publisher, title, and so on. I have conducted webinars about how to do an annotated bibliography, okay? And but I think I'm going to repeat them again if they are not have already been considered an automated webinar. Don't worry, Marion. Remember, we are here to learn together, and learning implies making mistakes. And I can say that I'm very that I have been very impacted to be confused with Alana. It's not only because she is very tall and I'm very short, but because she has a great mind, and mine is not so bad. Okay, all right. So, the methodology chapter functions as a manual to guide other people to interpret and replicate your study. The clearer the instructions are, the easier and more valid the evaluation of your work is. You know that your work is going to be evaluated, and not only by your supervisor or your committee, but anybody who reads your work. And they are going to pay very close attention to the methodology. Why? Because they want to know if you did the whole process in a valid and coherent way, if you have made wise decisions, if there could have been a more useful option and why you don't choose it. And also because they may be interested in replicating your study. Because of that, the purpose of the chapter is to make clear how the whole study was conducted and why it was done in that way. Okay, these are the most common headings used in the methodology chapter. Of course, there are other options. And because of that, you need to check the required outline with your supervisor. Okay, this is very important. But usually you have to talk about population and sample research design, data gathering, data analysis, procedure. If you use instruments, talk about those instruments. And you sometimes these two things are included in chapter 1, but sometimes in chapter 3. So limitation and assumptions. Okay, but you have to check if that is the required elements to be included in that chapter. The flow chart is intended to give you a basic view of what can be done to develop the chapter, and you already know the warning in relation to its sequence. But when you have your problem clear, your purpose clear, you have formulated your questions or your objective, from those questions or objective, you can infer population and sample, research design. And when you have population and sample and research design, then you can choose the right procedures. And when you have all those things clear, then you gather data and analyze them. As always, I highly recommend using Citavi to manage one's references, research notes, and citation. Is a bit pricey, but it's personally the best and most dependable reference manager out there. Thank you for the suggestion and the recommendation, Adrian. Good. So, this suggestion help you write the chapter focusing on being clear and justifying your decisions so other people can agree or disagree and perhaps use your work to future studies. So, when you are writing or organizing the methodology chapter, think of it as a recipe. I mean, you have to provide clear instructions in order to have a good cake or a good meal from the recipe that you are writing. It's the same with the methodology chapter. You have to provide clear and supported instructions, so when somebody is reading this, say, oh, I see why this person chose this and why that person didn't choose another thing. Okay? So let's go to the fourth part of your dissertation, which is devoted, just a moment that I have to turn my lamp on because raining is here. Okay, the fourth part of your dissertation is devoted to present your findings. And because of that, it is in fact the display of your work. Like any other showcase, it has to be coherent and attractive. Imagine you in front of a showcase of a store. If that showcase is not well organized and attractive, are you going to spend time in front of it? I don't think so. Okay? It's the same here. If it is presented in a confusing way, you will have problems selling your product. Let's see what you need to pay attention to avoid that. That's the reason behind these suggested procedures. Okay? They are all intended to help you organize your findings in a way that can be seen as easy to follow and relate to other parts of your dissertation. That's why it is very advisable to present your findings in the same order that you present your research questions or your objective. Because in that way, your readers can say, okay, all these results are the input to answer this research question and not another one. And you it is suggested that you do it simply and directly, and that you have to put yourself in the reader's shoes and ask yourself, what me as a reader would like to see in this chapter. Okay? The last one depends on your university or supervisor expectation, because sometimes and very often it says present finding but not discuss them, but sometimes it's the opposite. So you have to be sure what is being required from you. And that's the reason behind this suggested procedures. Now, text, tables, and graphs are the tools you use to present your findings. If you remember finding chapter that you have read, you will realize that they use text, tables, and graphs. Be careful not to include more that is needed to transmit the message. Say, how come that? If I put more tables, more graph, more colors, that would be very attractive, and people are going to say, whoa, how such a good work. The thing is that it's not a matter of repeating the same. It's a matter of using only what is necessary to convey what the finder referred to and its significance. So it's not that you are going to say the same thing in 3 different ways, with a text, with a table, and with a graph. Not. Each one of them has to have a specific purpose when you use them. Okay? And this is a possible way of approaching the development of the chapter. As you can see, findings should be linked to the research question or objective that provide information to. Why? Because they are the input to build the answer to the research questions. Okay? And this suggestion illustrates the idea of presenting results in a coherent and attractive way. This is why I tell you, for instance, use text to introduce tables and graphs, but you have to be simple and direct. Adrian, isn't it also necessary to discuss the theoretical implication of the empirical finding presented in chapter 4 and 5, especially related to the research question? Yes, and usually it is done in chapter 5, but that's why I told you that you have to check that with your university or your supervisor, because some committees like to have that discussion when you are presenting the findings, and some prefer to read all that in chapter 5. But of course, if you don't relate and explain your findings in relation to your questions, you have done nothing. Okay? Okay, and now the end is near, as Sinatra said, but now we get to the part of your dissertation in which you show everybody how amazing you and your work are. This is the very showing off part of your dissertation. The discussion of your findings is the tool to convince readers that what you did is valuable because it addresses a significant problem and you conducted it in a valid, coherent, and supported way. If you check the objective of the discussion of the findings, you will realize that you are in fact selling your work when writing this chapter, and that to do it, it's necessary to connect findings to the other parts of the dissertation so as to make them work together as a unit, coherent enough to convince. And this is the answer to your question, Adrian, right? You have to make all the things work together and function as a well-oiled unit, okay? A well-oiled machine. And this is what you usually do in the last chapter of your dissertation. You answer the research questions or objective. You interpret those answers, connecting them to literature review, because literature review will help you explain those answers. Discuss the implication of the study. Make recommendation to apply findings or doing possible future study. And something else. This is where you explain any unexpected finding. If you find something that you don't have thought about, that you have not expected to emerge, don't do what Donald Duck does with garbage in his house, that he just let up the rock and sweep it into under the rock. No, you take that unexpected finding and you interpret it, you explain it, and very, very frequently that unexpected finding is the most important and significant part of your study. So Adrian says, so the ultimate goal of chapter 5 is to establish the case that the study does advance the knowledge base of the field in new, unprecedented way. Yes, and that's why this is your showing off chapter. Because in this, when you do this very well, you are telling the people, hey, look, this is new knowledge, and I did it, and I did it well, and I did it in a coherent, valid, and supported way. Please congratulate me. Okay? And that's what you have to, that's the attitude that you have to have when you go to when you are in front of your committee defending your dissertation. Now, what I pointed about the need for building a coherent unit is reflected in this flowchart. You have your findings and you relate them to question and objective literature review, and then you discuss them. And you say, this finding is coherent to what this study found out, and it challenges what this study found out. Okay? So this is the part of your, together with the literature review, are the parts in which your critical analysis abilities should be in full blossom. And it is also reflected in these suggestions. They imply the need to link and support different parts of the dissertation that have to work together in order to convince reader, and also that conclusions and recommendation cannot go beyond what results actually show, because that makes them unreal and worsen the value of your work. Some people try to impress reader, providing incredible recommendations, and that's not good, because you cannot recommend what your data don't suggest. Okay, Adrian said, we should feel excited and eager to discuss and make a case for our study at the Viva. In other words, yes, of course. If you are not excited about your findings and about your work, how do you think you can convince professors who have spent 10, 20, or 30 years doing that work? No, you have to believe you are amazing. You have to believe your findings are amazing too, and you have the task of convincing your committee that you are right. Okay? So that's why I tell you at the beginning of this webinar that developing a dissertation is not only a cognitive task, it's also an attitudinal task. And that attitude can be the most important element between failure and success. Okay? And this is, for me, the main idea. And say, please keep in your mind that it is possible to develop a dissertation in a less overwhelming way if you plan and evaluate your action to be sure that you are following a coherent process, and that also commitment to the task is needed. You need both things. My intention today was to give you a general view of what you are expected to do and how you can do it. And I hope I have achieved my goal. Okay? Adrian says, my advisor always warns us against giving recommendations that are virtual lip service. Yeah. Such as that the study could use a larger sample size. It could have done more longitudinal. Yes, I mean, you have to restrict your recommendation to what your findings support. Don't get too excited in that part. Get excited about how amazing you are, how amazing your work is, but don't go too much, okay? Lip service recommendation, that's true. Oh, Annalyn say, Maria, I'm convinced that you are my doctoral guardian angel. Thank you. This is absolutely one of my all-time favorite webinars. It brings together what I learned from you in the past in my master in a clear, concise, yet intricately interwoven in a way like only you can do. Thank you very much, my dear. Any advice on defining key terms in Chapter 1? Well, the main criterion to know what you have to include in that part is that you define only the terms that are not general common knowledge. I mean, that are terms related specifically to the problem that you are dealing with, or using a linguistic term, that are meta-linguistic terms related to your field of study. So you don't define common terms, but those ones that are specifically of your problem, of the problem you study. Any other question? Any things that you want to share? Anything that you want me to explain again, or give you examples, or something like that? Define the terms in relation to how they are used in your own study. Yes, that's the most important thing. Yes, it is, because you know that sometimes a term has a definition, but may have more than one definition, and even a definition can be approached from different points of view. So you have to be clear about how did you really interpreted that term in your study. I have to include a policy rationale. Any pointers? Well, at first sight, and without knowing anything about the topic and that kind of things, if you have to defend, to include a policy rationale, you have to link that policy to the problem that you are studying, because the characteristics and the nature of the problem may impact the context into from which it emerges, so you have to make that clear. Not necessarily like the motivation for the study, because the motivation from the study is usually related to both the identify gap and also to your interest in studying it. I think that Triana refers to a policy because she might be studying something related to making decisions that should be made by officials and that should be related to social elements. I think so. I mean, as I said before, I don't have more elements to evaluate that question. Okay. Any other question? Okay. Yes, my background is education, and I'm looking at teacher leadership. I see, in school. You see? Okay. So, what you have to think when you are writing your policy rationale is how what you are studying can be related to the leadership of a teacher, because leadership is a social and political sometimes issue, and it has to be very clear related to what you are doing. Leadership is something that some aspects of leadership, not all of them, have to be are usually decided or related or impact by the policy of other agencies, for instance, the policy of educational boards and that kind of things. Okay? Derek says, is it typical to merge the main conclusion into the discussion of finding, or have a separate session summarizing the final conclusion concisely? In my opinion, it should be the later way. I mean, it should be a heading which says conclusion, and you make your conclusions there. However, that depends on the requirements of your university or your requirement of your supervisor of your committee. Okay? You have to check the whole outline with them so you can go on a sure path. Adrian say, oh, I get it. Something like top-down rationale as opposed to simple evidence-based rationale. Yes, my dear, because policy is always on the macro level. Okay, it goes top-down. And we are used to work on the micro level. I mean, our classrooms, our schools, and so on. But when you are talking about leadership, it has elements that are influenced by policies, macro policies. Oh, I'm glad you consider my explanation, Triana, very helpful. You know that I love that topic of leadership, teachers' leadership. And I am very interested in that because I love the task of helping teachers being better teachers. And leadership is part of that. Thank you, Dory, for considering this a great webinar. Thank you. And but you know that leadership can be done not only on the big macro level, but it begins on the micro level when you are the leader of your classroom. Then you go to other teachers and work together to build a school leadership and that kind of thing. Okay, Kyla said thank you for this helpful presentation. Max says thank you for the presentation. Triana said yes, I'm looking at teachers leading professional learning in schools. Webinars have helped me so much today. Good. I love that. I love that topic. And in fact, I'm working on that. And I think that I'm going to develop something more formal in relation to that. Annalise says, on the cover, you have a picture of notice board. This one. Okay. I found it extremely helpful to set up a large whiteboard where I have a space for each chapter. Good. I write important ideas down under each chapter, and it's amazing to just sit and look and let one's brain make connection. Bravo! That's the kind of result that I love to foster in you. That made me so happy, because that's my duty as a teacher, to give you the seed to build your own approaches, your own ideas, to make your own products. Love it. May I ask a quick question about intercoder reliability? Okay, let me first, stop the recording, okay? First. Thank you very much, everybody, for registering on this webinar. Hope you register for new ones, okay? I think that the next one would be evaluating the quality of your academic writing. And then I have to setting the tone and stance in academic papers, and then going back into the argumentation field with 3 webinars, one about classical, another one about dialectical argumentation, and the last one about analytical argumentation. Okay, so let me stop the recording. No, it's not here. No, what? Oh, just a moment. Sometimes I got lost. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Welcome to today's webinar. I will give you an overview of what it takes to go from the idea you want to transform into a dissertation to the product you are ready to submit to your committee or supervisor. This is like a kind of eye-opener to help you realize